Greetings, everyone. This is Natraj from Quantum Advisors. COP26 to be held in November 2021 in Glasgow is an important milestone in the fight against climate change. While there have been many positive outcomes from the previous climate gatherings, much needs to be done. As Sir David Attenborough once remarked, cherish the nature world because you're a part of it and you depend on it. And he goes on to say, the world is finite and we need to look after it. Business India Climate Change Weekly, published by Business India, will host a series of interviews between now and the run-up to COP26 and beyond to get a sense of how various individuals and organizations are preparing for the new world of planet, people, and profit. We have with us Marcie Frost, Chief Executive Officer of California Public Employees Retirement Scheme, to kickstart the series. As CalPERS CEO, Marcie Frost oversees a $1.6 billion budget and 3 lines of business: pensions, health benefits, and investments. With an investment portfolio of about $485 billion, CalPERS is the country's largest pension plan, administering a defined benefit retirement system for 2 million California public employees and their families. CalPERS also is the nation's second largest purchaser of healthcare, covering more than 1.5 million lives. She serves on the UN Global Investors for Sustainable Development Alliance, has been appointed as a steward for the Council for Inclusive Capitalism at the Vatican, and represents the US on the International Center for Pension Management Board of Directors. Welcome, Marcie, and thank you for taking your time. I want to kickstart with a question on the CalPERS investment philosophy and how it has evolved over a period of time. And my colleague Chirag, who is also on the call, has a few questions of his own later. But to kick it off, what we saw in the 1980s is that pension funds, including CalPERS, divested from companies that were doing business in South Africa as a reaction to apartheid policies there. How has CalPERS investment policies evolved over a period of time, and how have you incorporated sustainability in your investment framework now?
Great, thank you. I appreciate having the opportunity to join you today. So, CalPERS has evolved over time. I think, many of the other public pension plans have really done the same, where divestment and removing, capital allocation to get to a certain outcome was really the only option, I think, at that point in time that trustees or executives were really contemplating or had in their tool belt. But what we've found since that time, the evolution and the importance of engagement and the importance of an active voice at the table trying to help companies or help resolve certain issues related to climate, related to human capital, related to governance issues. That I think what we have found, in particular for CalPERS and being the largest U.S. public pension plan, is that our voice really does matter, and our ability to coalesce around a single topic and convene a group of like-minded investors, like we did with Climate Action 100 Plus. I think our philosophy is if you're not at the table, your voice really doesn't matter. And over the last 5 years, I would say, in particular, engagement, whether that's directly with a public company, we now have an engagement mechanism, which I can talk about on the private company side. We just released that last week along with Carlyle. That these are important topics for sustainable companies and important topics for the markets to be more inclusive and frankly priced more appropriately than they are today, not recognizing certain types of risks, of which CalPERS is a long-term investor. We invest for decades. We have liabilities, i.e. pension payments being paid to those 2 million members. So we can't just think about short-term quarterly returns or whether that company was successful in a quarter. We have to look at success of a company over decades. And this term of ESG, I think it has been a bit overused. What it really means to us is that it's about sustainability. It's about sustainability of the portfolio that rewards based on the risks that we are taking in our capital allocation processes.
Right, and you also touched a little bit on the engagement. Could you just elaborate as to, do you have a 5-year ropeway to engage with these fossil fuel companies or coal companies, which are perceived to be bad for climate in general? But if you were to come to developing markets, these companies are very crucial to nation building. So how do you manage that engagement?
There are a couple of ways to manage engagement. One I briefly touched on, and that's Climate Action 100 Plus. There's $55 trillion in assets under management behind that, that push and that engagement strategy with companies that are, the largest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. That's where we think you can't focus on all 10,000 companies in our case, but if we can focus on the 100 companies that are, have the biggest impact, carbon impact to our portfolio. So that's one way that we do it, but we do not, certainly it's not CalPERS alone. We have a set of companies that we directly engage with through that. Through Climate Action 100 Plus. And then we also have a sustainability team. We have our team that engages and does our proxy voting. And those are typically, more private engagements. I think the other thing that we learned in the 80s and 90s when CalPERS got out there a bit on what I would call public shaming of companies, if they weren't managing their risks or managing certain expectations that we had in our investment beliefs, we would make that a little more public than I think is really necessary. We believe that private engagement, we believe that getting a set of data, a set of metrics that are normalized and standardized, that we can see, evolution or improvement over time, that's the way to really transition that brings everyone along. And, I think one of the questions that I've gotten more recently is about greenwashing and, how do you know you're just not being greenwashed? So we know that there's a lot of work yet to be done on the data side and the development of metrics that can be applied either across sectors or across countries. And what I'm seeing more recently is a coalescence around both on the private equity side with GPs and LPs, but also in the public side. So engagement is a part of our sustainability strategy, but also policy development and working with the regulatory bodies like the SEC here in the US or IFRS, and setting that transparency of what companies have to report, whether that is greenhouse gas emissions or the use of alternative energy sources or human capital or governance and the diversity of board members, and not just the diversity of board members, but very important that it's diversity at all levels of the decision-making process, including C-suite, investment decisions, et cetera. So we have many ways in which we engage, and no single path works for all of the engagement channels that we have to use. But we have really developed this out and matured it over the last 5 years, that it's policy, engagement, and then integration into the portfolio.
Right. On this climate change itself, from you've seen wildfires in California right in your backyard to famines in Madagascar to floods in Europe, and we've had Himalayan mountains collapsing in the recent past near India. Climate change is manifesting in many ways. What is your view on how climate change is affecting the world, and as a result, our investment framework at CalPERS?
You're right. I mean, we are based in Sacramento, California. We've had the worst wildfire season on record. Just an hour and a half north of us, Lake Tahoe, significant fires burning there over the last few months. And I think we've gotten to the point where people have started to understand that this climate change is real, that the science supports it, and you see fewer climate deniers and more, okay, if we recognize that, there are issues happening around the world, and that I'm beginning to experience them in my local community, because I think people do not believe it's real until you experience it yourself. It's, I call it experiential learners. Unfortunately, that means we're a little bit late to the game, but food scarcity, water scarcity. We've done some work on zip code risk. We invest, again, for decades, and looking at our real estate portfolio, looking at, real estate that, might be close to the water tables, and seeing that rise over time. So this is not something that any single country or any single entity like CalPERS can resolve. This is going to take, a monumentum effort to really get people to work together toward these common goals and common outcomes. But as we're investing $500 billion on the behalf of 2 million members. And so we have to make sure that the investment decisions we're making are very steeped in the data and the research. And you'll see our push and, continue to push on the transparency of those metrics, so that we understand whether that company understands the risks that they're taking on, but also how are they mitigating those risks over time. And that's back to that private engagement. So We'll continue. But if we believe that engagement isn't working at the pace that we think it's working, we can still use our capital allocation processes to say we can't allocate capital to a sector or to a company or to a country where we don't think that those risks are being managed and that we will see a return on the risk that we're taking by tying up our capital.
Sure, Marcie. I can reckon that climate change is clearly more accepted today as it was earlier. But if you look at the climate change, it's largely a result of consumption habits in the developed economies like what we've seen in US, Europe, Japan. The numbers speak for itself. But if you were to look at the next 20, 30 years, where emerging economies will go through their own consumption cycles and contribute significantly, if we don't fund that growth so that they achieve prosperity as well as growth sustainability. So has the time come to shift the debate on climate change to emerging economies with a large population base, given much of the climate delta will be contributed by them? So what are you on that?
Yeah, I mentioned in our prior Q&A that the problem cannot be solved by any single country, and also no country can be left behind. And the developed economies certainly have led this problem in its creation, and we can't leave countries behind that are starting to build out their prosperity. But we must find the right regulatory environment that continues to allow for both innovation in clean energy, as well as prosperity. And if we look at the emerging markets and where growth is going to be happening, and we assume a 6.8% growth on our portfolio. The emerging markets are really interesting to us, and capital needs to be invested, but it needs to be invested in innovation, and it needs to be invested in innovation that really deals with these risks related to climate. So I think the prosperity issue can be front of mind. I think it can have capital, feed into it, but it's really up to each of the countries to figure out how to solve this problem together. And whether that's, technology development, whether that is, I don't have all the answers, obviously, but the work on the just transition is really intended to, how do we bring everyone along in this transition? There are parts of the world still that are so reliant on, non-clean energy, but they can't be left behind. You can't go to flip on a light switch and have no light or have no power or have no heat. And so everyone has to come along in the transition. But I think for CalPERS, it's about investing in innovation and the technology that really speeds up this transition prior to 2050. And I think the emerging markets in particular are very well situated to address this significant problem we have.
Sure. I think emerging economies with the help of the technology can kind of leapfrog to a better world for sure. But now let's take a closer look at investing. Given active managers have been not able to generate alpha and the lower cost that they've the passives provide, there is the move from the pensions of the world towards more passive approach to investing. So in that process, do you think passive strategies would work when it comes to ESG-based investment decisions, considering most of the benchmark indices, more so in the emerging markets, are not so clean? They have companies with questionable governance or fossil fuel-based businesses. So does that answer, or do you need to kind of change your approach?
Well, I think the approach is not only engaging with companies, but also having changing expectations for the index providers. You're right, much of our equity portfolio is passive. The public equity, the listed company side is passive, most of it. And we are really, we're very careful about any active risk we take on in the portfolio, but it doesn't mean we won't use our active risk budget to think about how we allocate capital to industries or companies where we think that they are handling this transition at a pace greater than what we're seeing, the rest of a particular index. So, I think more expectations from asset owners like CalPERS, asset managers, we have very large asset managers out there, to apply a little more pressure to these index providers, both on the data side, right, the transparency of the information, but also managing some of these conflicts in governance and additional screens, conflict screens that right now we have the option, we can be notified of certain conflict screens and we can decide whether we want to stay within that particular company, even within the index. But I think, simply having an index provider say, we're just providing you these options, yet there isn't sufficient data in the markets. There isn't sufficient data about public companies around the globe, frankly, for us to really understand whether there is a significant conflict or whether this is, just something that we don't have eyes into. So I think there's a significant role for the index providers, and I'd like to see them come to the table with us.
Right, and in your engagement with these stakeholders, be it the index providers or the regulators or people who are trying to come with the common standards for reporting, because companies report carbon emissions, nobody knows whether it's the right number or wrong number. What has been the typical response been? I mean, are they open to change those ideas, or what has been the general observations that you've seen? And in the developed world and in the emerging world, because I think those are two different buckets in isolation.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think people, the companies that we're engaging in, either through Climate Action 100+, which are global companies, or on the private side, the unlisted companies, and the public side, the listed companies here in the U.S. or domestically. I think there's a willingness and an openness to this. I think there's some fear about the level of transparency and what might happen to the quarterly earnings report if there's transparency around greenhouse gas emissions. But we need to have the same expectations of these companies. Provide us the data, and in talking with a number of CEOs in these companies, I don't sense resistance to this. What I sense is we need to come along together. One company can't get too far out there without their counterparts or their competitors out there with them. And I think they would like investors like CalPERS or like a BlackRock to have a consistent set of metrics that they can report out on. I think sometimes the asset management and asset owner industry, we come up with what we think is meaningful to our portfolio, and we have different expectations than other investors around the world. So I think there is an opportunity to be more consistent and more standard in the requests that we're making to these CEOs of public companies, or frankly, we're making to general partners as a limited partner around the globe. So, I don't sense resistance. I sense there's some inconsistency. There's a little bit of, fear about what that might be in the short term as we're looking to invest in the long term. But the conversations are changing. I would say 5 years ago, there was still resistance. But today, it's not as much resistance, more in how do we do this in a fair and meaningful way that brings everyone along.
Okay, and sticking on that same buckets of geographies, traditional pension allocations is based on public equities, debt, private equity, and infrastructure real estate in separate buckets. So with this sustainability as a theme, do you have has a time come for a separate allocation towards sustainable as a single bucket on its own, or is it integrated in the existing buckets? How would that evolve over the next 5, 10, 20 years?
Mm-hmm. I think where we're at in this cycle is that we believe sustainable investing needs to be factored into all of our asset classes, whether that's public equity, private equity, real estate, real assets, fixed income. That we have to take sustainability measures and due diligence, and we have to place those into all of the integration decisions that we're making for the portfolio. That's today. That doesn't mean that 5 years, 10 years from now, as you indicate, that we may need to evolve that. If we don't see the progress that is necessary, we may need to evolve that and set up a separate allocation. I know there are funds that have, frankly, done that. But so far, it's engagement, it's the policy and the regulatory environment to make effective changes there. But if we don't see the appropriate progress leading toward this 2050 date, which is very important to CalPERS, then we may have to look at asset allocation a bit differently. But I think what we more likely would do is make capital allocations differently within the current asset class structure. And that, that fits our investment beliefs where, we manage risks on, 3 forms of capital. And, one of the most important responsibilities we have as CalPERS of either, the CEO, the CIO, or the board of trustees. We have 13 trustees here. and is the fiduciary responsibility we have to the 2 million members of the system. And right now, that fiduciary responsibility means we have to invest to have a view that we can get close to that 6.8% growth over time. And I think as we look at the true investment opportunities related to ESG right now, they've been a little more difficult to find to get us to the growth assumption we need. But we are finding opportunities in alternatives and in private assets. About 20% of those portfolios are now invested in what we would call green investments. But I think our view, at least today and in the near future, is that this integration and the risk framework related to ESG, that it has to be factored into the decisions that are being made in the asset allocations or in the asset classes versus having a separate asset allocation or asset class for sustainable investing.
Perfect. That's completely understandable. And there are a lot of products and service providers riding this thematic of sustainability, ESG, impact investing, and everyone wants a share of the pie. Much as there is ESG, there is also what we have called internally, and we have been telling investors, is eyewash, hogwash, and greenwash, ESNH. As an asset allocator, what are the key factors that you look for when you decide any of the sustainable investment solutions through this lens of EHG as well as ESG?
That's a great question. I hadn't heard the eyewash and hogwash, so thank you for that. I think like other investors, when we are doing due diligence on a deal and we'll ask three pretty deep probing questions, and we see some of the ESG related discussions start to fall apart, and that obviously that's something we watch for. It cannot happen, but our emphasis and our focus has been and will continue to be until we get it, is getting the data that we can make informed investment decisions on. So one of the things I mentioned earlier is that we paired up with Carlyle, one of our GPs that we do a lot of work with in the private equity space. And we came up with a set of metrics, and two of those metrics around sustainable companies are related to climate. And that is, the greenhouse gas emissions, as well as the use of clean energy. And so you see the private equity space starting to really understand that this is something that an LP needs. Likely these are metrics or data and measurements that the GPs already have within their portfolio companies. But some of this it's not transparent enough to the investors. It's not transparent enough to the stakeholders so that they actually know that we're paying attention, that we're managing this risk. And it may not be moving at the pace that many of our stakeholders would like us to make. And you asked me a question about divestment. We still get a lot of pressure about divesting from fossil fuel companies, as an example. We're completely divested from coal. But we are, going to continue to get that pressure. And the way that we respond is that engagement really does work. And we have several of examples of where we think our engagement strategy, our engagement posture has worked in a very successful way. Now, as we get closer to 2050, we'll have to determine whether that engagement is still going to work or whether, our capital allocation processes need to change. But divestment does not work. If we move away from a company, it will be an investment decision based on, this review and analysis and diligence that we've done, that we don't think the company is managing their risks appropriately. So those are the things we're looking at. We're still missing a lot of data to be able to make those allocation decisions. And you'll see us continue to push pretty significantly in that space. And we are making headway. We're making a lot of progress there. And I'm really proud of the work that's been done with the private equity team, Greg Ruiz out of our team, working with Carlyle and coming up with these metrics around ESG for the private equity space. We just need the data transparency also coming from the listed company space. And we're not there yet.
Yeah, sure.
Marcie, given that we are approaching COP26, if you had to give 3 recommendations to COP26, what would they be?
So I think creating a regulatory environment and a market environment that rewards the transitions. We have way too many subsidies that are incentivizing the wrong behavior or incentivizing, not the technology that we need to help this transition move along more smoothly. So let's subsidize the transition versus subsidizing the fossil fuel companies. I think the second is putting a price on carbon. It needs to be priced appropriately and fairly within the markets, a fair level playing field for all. And then to the extent that we can coalesce on a set of metrics, and we're a little agnostic to what framework is being used, but let's coalesce on a set of metrics so that we understand what our baseline is. We have all agreed to 2050. We do not have a good understanding of what that baseline is and whether we're making progress toward those 2050 goals. So those would be my three recommendations or three requests of our leaders. Yeah,
if I may just chip in with one question, which is, at the US, especially North America, gender and inclusion, more of inclusion as opposed to gender, which is only a small subset of it, is a lot of mainstream discussion points. And even we engage with our portfolio companies on those aspects, and we have seen some marked progress, but at the aggregate level, the data is still not very encouraging, but hopefully it will get there. So especially on the gender aspect, what are the typical point of conversations that you would like to see as an outcome over the next 5-10 years in your portfolio companies or in investment decisions?
Well, CalPERS has been a long believer in that diverse companies, including gender diversity, that those companies are going to perform better in the long run, that these different perspectives and different backgrounds to inform decisions that company, those will be sustainable decisions for that company. I've said this on the record before, and I'll say it again here. There are still too many meetings where I'm the only female in the room, and that has to change. And this is where the regulatory environment, one of the things that the state of California has done, legislatively, is for any company that operates out of the state of California, that they must have at least one female on the board. One female is not going to make a difference. It usually takes, the three voices to really have an impact. And, I'm optimistic here. I do have a lot of optimism that the value of diversity, including, gender diversity, will become more important as limited partners, in the private equity space, or asset owners, $500 billion, as we're starting to make these requests about, this is tied to our fiduciary duty. If we firmly believe and fundamentally believe that a company will perform better with diversity on their board, in their C-suite, in investment decisions, then that does fulfill our fiduciary responsibility, and we can engage more directly on that topic. And we have a group here at CalPERS where we have a Sustainable Investment Research Institute. We call it SIRI, before SIRI was a part of Apple. And we're just refreshing that research on both climate as well as human capital and the role of diversity, or the lack thereof, in the investment industry, and the impact that potentially has had on returns. So these are top areas for CalPERS, whether we call it ESG, whether climate, human capital and governance, or we call it sustainable investing. It really doesn't matter to us, but sustainable companies have to be diverse companies.
Absolutely, makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely, Marcie. So thank you so much, Marcie. I think we all have to move in together. It's all encompassing. Solutions have to be all encompassing, and we all have to strive toward that better world. So as David Attenborough said, that there is so much more out there than what connects to us. So I think it's really very evident from today's conversation with you. So thank you so much. And I really appreciate you joining us today and sharing those interesting insights as to how the biggest pension fund in the US is thinking on the climate change and other ESG issues. I really hope that COP26 is hearing this and embraces your recommendations as much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.